Okay, hello and welcome to this webinar. We're delighted to be joined by Dr. Jeff Carpenter today, who's going to be talking to us about social media in relation to teachers and schools, and he's got lots of really interesting stuff and work that he's been doing with teachers and in the classroom. So, Jeff, would you like to introduce you a bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, so I work at Elon University, which is in North Carolina, and I'm an associate professor of education there, and I run a program called the Teaching Fellows Program, which is a 4-year scholarship and academic program for aspiring teachers. My background is I was a middle school and high school English teacher for 10 years. I taught English and English as a second language. I started my career in rural Japan in a little mountain village where I was the only non-Japanese person, pretty much. Had a wonderful experience there teaching, learned a lot about teaching. I learned a lot about the value of teachers collaborating. So I was exposed to lesson study there, which is an iterative, teacher-driven action research cycle that I didn't entirely understand what was going on because my Japanese wasn't great. But I got this sense that something powerful was happening with teachers collaborating and driving their own professional learning. So I came back and taught in the U.S. I was taught in Honduras for a year, but I taught in the U.S. for a number of years. I was a department chair. I coached athletics as well. I realized a lot of this audience is PEH teachers. That wasn't my area, but I did coach. So I've got a little bit of connection to that world. And so, yeah, when I did my PhD, I did it on lesson study in the US context and really dug in on that and got a better understanding of that process. And then when I took my job at Elon, there wasn't lesson study happening right around Elon, and I didn't feel like it was natural to the lesson study process for me, the higher ed institution, to sort of initiate it. And so I was looking around for something else to do research on, and one of my colleagues who was from grad school, who was still a teacher, told me about how interesting things were happening on Twitter. And so I, like maybe some of you all, was initially skeptical of why in the world educators should have any interest in social media. It seemed like, everything that I might be against as an educator, sort of narcissism and, pictures of what you had for breakfast, etc. So I was kind of baffled initially by why I should take an interest. But I eventually realized that some of the same stuff that was happening with lesson study, some of the same dynamics were happening on social media. So teachers were taking charge of their own professional learning instead of waiting to be professionally developed by sort of external forces. They were saying, okay, I'm going to go out there and learn how to get better. And social media is a place that I can start some of that. It's not where necessarily you do all your professional learning, but you get connected with other educators. You find people all around the country or the world maybe who are thinking about some of the same issues as you are, maybe in different ways than you are. And I saw pretty quickly, once I got in the right places on social media, what positive things were happening there in some of these teacher communities. And so that's what a lot of my research has been on. And I have done a little bit of research also on student use of social media, classroom-based use as well by teachers. So,
wow, that's definitely a kind of journey from Japan to now looking at how social media, because I know one of the things you talk about is isolation and how you got into social media and that aspect of isolation and the one size fits all. Is that kind of one of your key findings from social media research with teachers, that social media can help us move beyond that?
Yeah, so as an English teacher, I was often working in schools where there was a department of maybe 10 to 15 other English teachers. And so I was fortunate in that regard that I had maybe more face-to-face colleagues that I could access. But even amongst those 10 or 15, a lot of them didn't necessarily have the same educational philosophy as me, or maybe they were teaching different classes than I was. And so there weren't a lot of face-to-face people for me to talk shop with in a meaningful way with much depth. And so, yeah, we found a lot of, in the research I've done on various platforms, we find that as a consistent finding that teachers talk about. Social media sort of expanded the faculty room, the workroom for them, and gave them access to teachers that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. Just in the US, there's more than 3 million teachers. And so, why would you limit yourself to only interacting with 5, 10, 15 teachers? You probably need to have at least somebody in your building you can go to face-to-face. And that face-to-face connection is meaningful, no doubt. And there are limits on what you can do over social media, but yeah, there's a lot of connections you can make. And if you are teaching a subject like French, if you're a French teacher in the U.S., you're probably the only French teacher in your school. Who are you going to talk shop with? How are you going to figure out how to get better? And so same thing, if you're teaching AP, like advanced placement calculus, upper level classes, things like that. So social media is a really powerful tool to potentially allow educators to connect with that broader community of professionals that are out there.
Okay, so I mean, one of the questions is come up, and it's what groups would you recommend? So I suppose, how do you find these communities on social media? So I think that's probably the context of the question. Then if you've got any recommendations on specific groups. Yeah,
this is a trick. It can be tricky. Because there's not a convenient map that sort of delineates what all the groups are. And so it does, getting your foot in the door is the key step, because once you do sort of make some connections, it usually just snowballs. But finding that first place is important. So I've talked about Twitter as sort of the gateway drug. I think Twitter, because it's so radically open and there are so many education hashtags, is a great place to start. But then oftentimes it takes you other directions. So the Twitter hashtags, in my opinion, are probably the best place to start. There's multiple hashtags for almost every topic out there in education. And then through those, you can get connected to people, and you ask them sort of who should I follow? What are organizations that I should follow? And you may learn about, for my content area, there's actually a really good Reddit subreddit that's a great place. Or there's these closed Facebook groups that I should apply to join. Or there's a great Voxer group. I know that in the PEH world, Voxer's big. Or has been. So it can be tricky to make that first initial connection, and then from there it's just more organic networking, I would say. Okay, and so I suppose one of the papers that I remember that is kind of a key paper for me is like how and why do teachers use Twitter back in 2014. So I don't know if there's anything that's evolved from that, any key findings you want to share about why, beyond your own experiences, what you found with like the big numbers of teachers you've done research with on why do teachers use Twitter and social media, and what do they find the benefits? Yeah. So some people, I think, are using it in a very sort of instrumental, transactional focused way of like, I want ideas, I want resources, I want materials. So they're there to sort of get information. And so they may be teaching about a particular topic. And so they, if I was a high school English teacher again, so like I'm going to teach a unit on poetry. And so I'm trying to gather more resources about teaching poetry. I'm trying to gather maybe some examples of more recent poetry. So I'm not just using the old canonical poems. So you might be using Twitter just to gather ideas, pedagogical strategies, recommendations, things like that. But you might also just be trying to tap into, sort of related to this isolation issue, just define your people, your community. So it might not be as focused as I'm trying to find ideas of how to teach a specific poem or what poems to teach. It might just be I'm trying to develop a network and a set of people who I can go to with whatever teaching requests I have. And sometimes that is about, I want a resource or I want an idea for a lesson. And other times it's just like, I had a tough day and I just need to vent a little bit, or I just need somebody to give me a pat on the back and remind me that teaching's hard and everybody has rough days. And sometimes those types of conversations you might not have on Twitter. Yeah. So maybe you met the people through Twitter, but you have the venting conversations in a more private sphere. And then, other people I think are on Twitter because maybe their initial reason is not to sort of try and have an impact on the profession. But some people, once they get there and sort of make some initial connections and are maybe in more of a taking mode, start to feel like, oh, maybe I can give back some. And what are ways I could mentor the next generation of teachers or share some of the practitioner wisdom that I've honed over the years?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, one of the questions that's come up as well is that sometimes people get lost in the conversations. So is there like a magic number, I suppose, on the size of like a group that you should engage with, or, going between a larger group and then a private group? Is there any kind of sense of, is it better to be in a small group that you create yourself?
I would recommend sort of having multiple groups, so maybe a bigger group that you go to for ideas. And that could just be a hashtag that you sort of find is the people talking about similar things as you. And so when you want ideas, maybe you go to that bigger group. And then when you need some emotional support around teaching, maybe you go to a smaller group. Or if you need to vent about your principal or your head teacher. So like one of the things that social media can be good for is sometimes you need to talk to people outside your school about like the internal school politics, because you need an outsider perspective. And so you might think of that as sort of like my outside of my school sounding board. It can get overwhelming to some extent, particularly if you give in to sort of what I've described as Twitter guilt, or I guess you could just call it social media guilt. There are people who try and keep up with everything, and that's impossible. So it's Twitter and social media in general have been described as a fire hose, and you can't drink out of a fire hose, right? You'll get washed away. And so one of the tricks is sort of figuring out how to partition the fire hose a little bit and not try and drink all of it. And then also just to be okay with like lots of stuff is going to happen that I'm just going to miss. And if it's really important, it'll come back up. The really important stuff doesn't just get tweeted once or doesn't get just shared once. And so, you do have to sort of be okay with just letting some of it go past.
So it kind of sounds like very similar to being offline. You get bombarded with information at school as a teacher, and it's going to come up in the staff meeting again and again and again if it's important. Where you've got to have private conversations and open conversations. So would you say it's the same kind of etiquette procedures as offline, or there's just some similarities that we've got to remember it's not completely new or different?
Yeah, a lot of the dynamics online mirror things that happen offline. The big key difference is just that social media can be a place where you're meeting people you wouldn't otherwise meet. And so that's the thing that's different. And so developing trust and relationships with people is a little different. Because you don't have a sense of sort of as much of a sense of who these people are. And we're probably all aware to a certain extent that people don't always share an entirely realistic or full portrayal of themselves on social media. So we all curate a little bit what we present. And so that's important to keep in mind, is that sometimes people present themselves on social media in slightly idealized ways. And so that's just something to be aware of.
And okay, so we just had a comment on the StreamYard, so I was just reading that as it came up. We've had another question just come in, so there's lots of things just popped up then. Is there anything kind of around the facilitators and barriers to teachers using social media for their professional development?
Yeah, I just published a paper with Stephen Harvey, who I believe, Vicki, you know, from the PEH world, about barriers and challenges. And so definitely thinking about that. One that we found it, and it is consonant with other literature, is this managing personal and professional boundaries. So that's something to just the teachers may need to think about is, if you, for example, find some teacher Facebook groups, those can be very good. But if it's closed or if it's open may matter. And if you're using your personal Facebook account, you may just need to think about what the settings are and who will be able to see what about you. And so social media does present new sort of challenges around personal and professional. So if you set up a Twitter account, you may want to think about, am I going to keep this 100% professional? Or am I going to mix in some personal stuff? Instagram is a big one, just in the last couple of years, where more teachers are using Instagram. And a lot of people are mixing the personal and the professional on Instagram. And that can be good to some extent in terms of developing that trust, which I was talking about earlier, about sort of how do you trust people that you only know online. And when you mix in the personal a little bit more, you seem real to others more so. But there can be boundaries that you might cross that you maybe are not aware of in terms of your community. And so, there can be things like, well, I think it's fun for me to have a glass of wine in my personal time on the weekend, and I post it on my Instagram so that I'm relatable to other people. But what if some people in my school community think that teachers shouldn't be, sort of publicly drinking, etc.? So yeah, the personal professional thing is an issue. The credibility of other users is something that is a challenge. And so finding out sort of what basis are people making claims about, this works or this doesn't work. There's not the information gatekeepers with social media. And so you do have to be a critical consumer of what people say. And social media can sort of contribute to fads a little bit. And so, people get really excited about certain activity or a lesson or things like that. It gets shared a lot. And then teachers might use it there's a risk of teachers using it in an uncritical way or not thinking about, how does this need to be adapted for my students or my school? I probably shouldn't just sort of use it just because it worked somewhere else. There's likely different dynamics at my school. How does it fit within the standards or the curriculum that I'm expected? And just kind of hopping on it because it got lots of retweets or likes, it may not be a sound choice.
Yeah. Okay. So brilliant. So you're just moving away from teachers using social media for their professional development. I'm wondering if how they use it for their professional development translates or transfers into the classroom. Have you found anything about how teachers use social media in the classroom?
The thing that I haven't determined yet, but I'm really interested in seeing if this is the case, is so teachers who use social media seem to like that it allows them to have autonomy as learners. So they get to pick sort of what they're doing. It's not somebody telling them you have to learn this or that. They get to choose what they're learning, and then they get to collaborate with other teachers. in a social fashion. And so what I'm interested to know is if teachers experience more of that as learners, do they then provide more such opportunities to their students? I'd really be interested to see if sort of teachers who use social media for professional learning end up giving their students then more autonomy and more social learning opportunities. But that's just a hunch. Or something I'd like to investigate, but teachers do. There is some research on educators' use of social media with their students. A study that I've done relates to the Global Read Aloud, which is a program that a teacher in Wisconsin originated, and through it she connects teachers around the world, and they all read a similar book, the same book, for a 6-week period in the fall. And then they discuss the book across their classrooms. And they discuss it sometimes via social media. So the teachers get connected with each other via social media. This is a free program. Again, it's just a teacher in Wisconsin who is a saint. Her name is Pernille Ripp, and she organizes all of this. But a lot of it is teacher driven. And so the teachers buddy up or find each other via social media. And then they have their students communicate via social media as well. So they'll use things like Padlet as a discussion forum. There's Twitter hashtags for the books. The authors have realized that actually, if you get picked for Global Read Aloud, you're going to sell a lot of your book. And so the authors now will oftentimes engage with the social media that is being used during the Global Read Aloud. So they'll respond to tweets from classes. I was in a classroom that was participating in the Global Read Aloud. And so the class I was in North Carolina was Skyping with another class, and it was a 2nd grade class. And the two classes ended up having this little spontaneous dance party. It was absolutely adorable. The kids were super engaged. And so, yeah, that's an example of sort of using the social media as a way to connect and discuss among students. Certainly, there's even additional levels of safety that you have to have with that around privacy in terms of service and things like that. So the Global Read Aloud has been around now since 2010, I believe it is. So teachers have gotten more savvy about kind of like which use social media to use in which ways that are not going to sort of jeopardize their students' safety or privacy.
So do you think that's the main way social media can be used in the classroom then? So to facilitate collaboration and different forms of expertise between different students and different knowledge? Is that the kind of collaboration bit is the main?
Yeah, so the first time I used social media with my college students is I thought it was going to be a good way to sort of extend their classroom conversation outside of class. And I thought they were going to talk to each other via social media. And then I realized like that's just not, they don't need that. They can talk to each other by lots of means. That's not what social media is good for. What social media would be good for would be having them talk to other people outside of their class. And so, yeah, there's experts on whatever you're teaching. There are other experts out there beyond you as the teacher. And so why not try and figure out sort of how to get your students in contact with some of those experts. And so my students now, whenever we read something, they immediately go and try and find if the author of what we have read has a Twitter account, and they start tweeting questions at the author. And sometimes the author doesn't have a Twitter account or doesn't respond, but sometimes they do. And my college students find that really fun and interesting to see, kind of hear directly from the authors. And yeah, and in particular, a lot of these children's book authors are happy to, I mean, for them, it's drumming up business. They're happy to, if a class sends them a tweet, asking them a question or making a comment, it's not a lot of work for them at some point to like the tweet even, or shoot back a quick little response. And I mean, imagine, I loved reading. Obviously, I ended up being an English teacher. If one of the authors whose book I had read in 1st or 2nd grade had responded to a message we sent or something, I would have been over the moon with excitement about that. So, and then talking to other students about a similar topic. So, Certainly in the US, we still have problems with our public schools being somewhat segregated. And so students tend to sit in classrooms with a lot of peers who are very similar to them, despite the rich diversity that we have as a country. Students often are in classes that are pretty homogenous. And so when they're reading a book, they're going to hear perspectives on that book that could be pretty similar to their own perspectives just because of similarities in life experiences. And so if they can hear from students from another part of the country or another part of the world, what do they think about To Kill a Mockingbird or whatever current event is going on, that can be very powerful.
And am I right in thinking that you've got a hashtag that you use to communicate information yourself? And is that within your teaching? Is it something you use?
Yeah. So at my institution, Elon. So I was originally using a class hashtag, and then I learned, okay, this isn't actually the purpose because I don't want them just talking to each other. Yeah. And so we now have what we call Elon Ed for the Elon School of Education, and so that's a hashtag that we use. And we have multiple professors in multiple classes who are either recommending some use of it or requiring some type of use of it. But then we have alumni who voluntarily join in. So they're kind of volunteer virtual mentors to our current students. And then we have local teachers who have either mentored our teachers or just live nearby and kind of feel a bit of an affinity for Elon as a result. And so they'll chime in. And then we also have just me and some of the other professors, our broader networks, because they're connected to us, have sort of gotten connected to that hashtag and will also mentor our students a little bit. Mm-hmm. So it's been very powerful because I don't know everything. I do not know everything. And I teach students who are preparing to teach in 7 different content areas and across all the grade levels. And so they'll ask me questions and I have no personal experience to draw on sometimes, so somebody who's in elementary or who's in music, like, I don't know how to give you advice on that, but my network, there may be somebody out there who knows. And so that hashtag has been good. And so I think a lot of schools could consider sort of having a school hashtag that the students might use.
Yeah, okay. And then there was just one kind of thing that I found interesting. Again, it was kind of the link between teachers' uses of social media in the professional development and in the classroom, is this idea of back channeling. And I know some people have been talking about back channelings going on at the moment in terms of discussion. Can you talk about a little bit about what back channeling is and how you've used it?
Yeah, so as a student, I was someone who would just talk. Like the teacher would ask a question and I would just start talking. I didn't sometimes know what I was going to say. I was just happy to talk. And as a teacher, when I began teaching, I benefited from every class I had. It seemed to be there were a couple people like me who were happy to talk. And so I'd be as an English teacher, would be discussing the literature and I would ask questions and there wouldn't be silence. And so I'd feel like, oh, we're having a good conversation. And then after a while, I sort of realized that it was often me and the same small group of students having the discussion and then everyone else was just kind of listening. And so it dawned on me that there's probably other ideas out there and just the people who are most sort of extroverted shouldn't be the only ones contributing. So I originally got interested in back channeling as a way to allow students who maybe wouldn't just sort of raise their hand and speak aloud extemporaneously would have a way to chime in. And so I used a tool for a number of years called backchannelchat.com. Today's Meet was a tool that was around for a while that has gone away, but it's just it can be Slack, it can be any virtual channel where students who don't want to raise their hand and speak aloud can still ask a question, make a comment. And so I've had good luck upping the participation rate. And in most cases where I've used a back channel on a semi-consistent basis, it turns out that there's a back channel star or two who is someone who never spoke up in class, and it totally changes the way their peers see them, right? So I taught this one class where I had a student in the class for one semester where I hadn't done any kind of back channeling, and she had never spoken except for when I had forced her to speak. Like, she never volunteered to speak. And then I taught a class where there was a lot of back channeling, and she had amazing ideas, asked great questions, and it totally transformed my perspective on her and her peers' perspective on her, because they had never heard her really chime in. And so they were all like, wow, who are you? And they knew who she was, but they just were surprised. And so, yeah, social media, back channeling, both can sort of give voice to students who maybe aren't as comfortable chiming in the sort of traditional front channel. And so I've seen the same thing with exact same thing has happened with social media and Twitter use. So some of my students who, when I require Twitter use, even though it's not a live back channel, some of the students who really do extremely well on Twitter are not necessarily the students I expected to. They're not the students who are speaking up as much in class, but maybe that extra time to pause and compose the tweet and think about wording it right. They appreciate that.
Okay, really, really interesting. So all the wisdom that you've shared with us and the really good information, what would be your top tip to teachers on social media?
For your own professional learning, balance sort of finding your people, because oftentimes when teachers first get on social media, they're really excited to sort of find some of these people who they click with. And that's exciting and good, and that's part of why you go on social media, but also find people who are different than you and who are going to challenge you and are going to maybe sometimes make you uncomfortable because they see the world in a different way than you do. So balance that, sort of finding the people who are like you and the people who are different than you. You don't want social media to become an echo chamber where everything everybody says in your network agrees with what your prior beliefs are. You want people to say things that will push you a little bit. And then in terms of learning, using it potentially with your students, I would say a big piece of advice that I had: don't do it because you think it's going to be cool or you think they're going to think it's cool. There are sound educational and pedagogical reasons to use social media. You don't need to use it because it's sort of the latest thing or because the students are there or you think it's going to somehow make you cool in their eyes. That's not a sound reason to do it, in my opinion. In most cases, like I thought Twitter was going to be cool, and my students were already like, yeah, Twitter's kind of passe. So I had to go to a different argument that, like, well, the teachers are there. You want to be a teacher, so it's a good place for you to be. It's because it's cool because teachers are there and you can interact with them.
Okay, so thank you so much for your webinar. Where can people find you and more information if they want to follow up on things you've said?
So I'm on Twitter at Jeff P. Carpenter. My middle name is Paul, so just the letter P. Jeff P. Carpenter. Sorry. And that's probably the easiest way to find me. And I've got a link in my bio to some other information. But
brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much. It's been a pleasure having you on this webinar, and I'm sure everyone's learned a lot from you. So thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity and all the good work you do, Vicki, around social media. I've learned a lot from reading your work, and it's a pleasure to chat.
Thank you. Okay.